brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Alright guys, well, I guess I'm going to go ahead and kind of start. Now, we are supposed to have a really exciting episode next week, well, 2 weeks from now, because we're still going to be doing Australia. Right now, I'm just going to do the peopling of Australia. And hopefully, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have somebody come on who will be much more expert on the Aborigine lifestyle, because it is somebody who has lived with the Aborigine peoples and is a member of an Aborigine family. So hopefully that's going to happen, and fingers crossed on that. So guys, we are on episode, what episode are we on? Somebody told me. And we are done with the Greco-Persian Wars. Yay. I'm done having to make battle maps. So we are going to do the early peopling of Australia. We're going to go back in time, probably about 74,000 years from the present, and kind of rewind back to our anthropological discussion. And I do want to send a shout out to a lot of different people whose information I'm drawing on. I'm drawing heavily on the website of anthropokines.ru. That's a Russian anthropology website. Droboshevsky and Sokolov run that website. They have a lot of really good anthropology publications on there. I also would like to thank the Genesis podcast, also another Russian podcast on genetics and genetic studies of various peoples around the world. And then there's so much literature out there. I mean, Aborigines is something that has been a controversial subject, and rightfully so, for quite a long time. So guys, if you're watching us, if you like what we're doing, go ahead and put a like. Comments are welcome. I try to respond to those when they're on topic as much as I can. And yeah, so moving forward. And then before we move forward, I do want to point out to anybody who is watching that there is a link on my channel. If you look at the post, there's a link for donations. There is a very famous, very talented, and very valued member of the podcasting history community. His name is Nick, and I'm sure a lot of you who, if you're watching history podcasts, probably have watched the Study of Middle Ages and Antiquities podcast. He is experiencing massive organ failure right now. Nick is basically on his deathbed. His family is struggling to pay the medical bills. I'll put the link for donations beneath this video. Please, if anybody is in position to donate anything towards this cause, please do. He has provided so much great work, and this is so unexpected. He's only 30 years old. They have one child. His wife is pregnant with their second kid, and they are acquiring massive, massive hospital bills with no known outcome. So, yeah, that's unfortunate news. And if anybody is willing to pitch in, I will place the link underneath this video. All right, so on to our Australian Aborigines. Only in 1992 did Australia start recognizing the land that the white Australians were populating as having been previously occupied by other peoples. Up until 1992, they did not recognize the continent as already populated. Up until 1960s, the Aborigine people were under the oversight of the Department of basically Land and Resources Management. The Aborigine people were not included in the census in Australia. The Australian Aborigines, very much to the Europeans, resembled the people they knew from the African continent, and the same racial prejudice was transferred onto the Australians. That's to begin with. The second thing that did not play in the Australians' favor is because Australian continent, because of its poverty of its resources, because it is such a niche and complex environment, and it has such different requirements and adaptations and in lifestyle than Europe or Africa did. Because it is a continent that has been more or less isolated from the rest of the world for quite a long time. as far as the fauna goes, as far as the peoples go. Of course, there were some contacts happening between the time when humans first arrived to Australia and to that entire region. The people in Australia took a very different evolutionary path than the people did in the rest of the world, even compared to the Americas, which were not as technologically advanced as the European continent, and by being joined the African continent and the surrounding areas as well. The Australian Aborigines concepts of warfare, concepts of organized society, concepts of life in every aspect of its existence were so vastly different, so vastly alien to the newcomers that, and their technological level was so different. And frankly, Australian Aborigines did develop their technology, but they developed their technology only in as far as it was required for the environment that they were facing. And so when faced with the advanced war technology, tactics, politics, and for other social suppression methods developed by the Europeans who came to their land, they were more or less helpless. There's not much you can do when you have a spear and people with guns on horseback are chasing you down. On their end, the Europeans, of course, we all know that Australia was basically gulag of a British Empire, where mostly political and other minor social criminals traveled to against their will. So it was not originally populated by the nicest of the people, even within the British society, English society. And the Aborigines are people who are very deeply tied to their land. Aborigine peoples, from the history of the United States, we know that even the Native Americans who had much more similar system of social structure and values to the Europeans, even they had a very hard time understanding what Europeans were talking about when Europeans were trying to purchase land from them, because to the to the traditional society, there's no such thing as ownership of the land. You cannot own the land like you cannot own the air, like you cannot own water. It's a concept that is so absolutely alien to any really traditional society. Aborigines were even more removed from that sort of concept. Aborigines had no concept of private property to begin with, in any way, shape, or form. They did not have any concept of monetary exchange. They didn't need any concept of monetary exchange. They believed to be of the land and to belong to the land as much as the land belonged to them. And while the way that the Aborigine groups worked, it's not, I might slip up and say the word tribes here and there throughout this podcast, but the chances are, just keep in mind that these are not tribes. Aborigine societies did not have tribes in the same sense that, let's say, that the Native Americans had tribes. Native American had tribes with a sense of kind of ethnicity, to where I belong to this tribe, you belong to another tribe, we are from different tribes. Aborigines did not have that structure in any way, shape, or form. Aborigine society was organized by one method and one method only, and that was familiar lineages. The only connection, the only self-identity that mattered in Aborigine societies were their connection to their direct relatives or their supposed relatives. Totemism was something that was very much important to the Aborigine society, to where people believed that they all originated within a group. All the males originated from one single animal or plant, kind of heroic predecessor. And so even if there was not necessarily genetic kinship between those males living within this small group, they genuinely believed that they had basically bloodline kinship, because they, let's say, all of them came from a hero, a kangaroo ancestor, or hero, you name it. A crocodile or any other sort of animal or plant that they happened to believe was their ancestor. And that was fairly common for a lot of traditional societies. Aborigine peoples, of course, are not the only peoples with this sort of totemic mindset. But for Aborigine peoples, family lineages became absolutely central to their self-organization. So because the land in Australia was so poor, agriculture was not something that let me say this. There is at least one scientist from the University of Victoria that does push forth the concept, and very actively, and with the support of the Aborigine community, pushes forward the concept that there was in fact farming practiced in Australia before the arrival of Europeans. Personally, having looked at this material at length and having had a fascination with Australian culture and the Australian continent, I find that very difficult to believe, simply because the soil in Australia is not particularly fertile, simply because there's no mentions of it in any Aboriginal tradition that I have come across. Hopefully, next episode, we will have somebody who is a member of the Aboriginal community join us, and he will be able to better address this particular controversial subject. But traditionally, it is believed that Aboriginal people did not have any agriculture of any sort of scope that would be worth looking at as a cultural phenomenon, which is, by the way, not quite true about the Tasmanian peoples, but we will talk about them a little bit separately. So these people only identify themselves as a part of a complex network of familial relationships, and this network stretched literally across the entire continent. So it was almost a fission fusion kind of society, to where wives moved to their husbands' family groups. These groups were not very large. I mean, a 50-person group was probably as large as you're going to get on this poor of a land, which would be a couple of men who believe themselves to be relatives, their multiple wives, and their subsequent children, and then perhaps one or two families of relatives of these wives who joined this particular group. Each group had a limited territory that they gathered resources from and hunted from. Each group knew their territory very, very thoroughly. And when because Australia is not exactly a safe continent for people to be on. I mean, on my visit to Queensland, I was married to an Australian. It was a tragic mistake of my life. But on our honeymoon visit to Australia, I remember his mother telling me that, honey, don't step in the water. The jellyfish is going to kill you. And don't pick those flowers that are hanging from the tree over there, because they're poisonous. And do you see that little green frog in the pool? Well, that little green frog is going to kill you. Bottom line is, in modern days, there are no large predators on the continent of Australia, other than really crocodiles. But there's a lot of little things, and they're all horribly, terribly, evilly poisonous. And the plants are so scarce. I mean, no, they're plentiful. You really got to know your land to be able to get the most out of it. And that is what Aboriginal people really excelled at. 70% of their sustenance really came from the work that was done by the females. The females were the ones who lived, who foraged, who collected various vegetable and plant foods, who gathered small protein items. Really, the economy hung on the shoulders of the women, and the males did traditionally hunting. Again, when we think of Australia, more modern day Australia is very desert-y, very flat land in a lot of places. And so the best way, and they didn't have horses, they didn't have carriages, they didn't have chariots, they didn't have any of that stuff. Majority of the Australian Aborigines didn't even have bow and arrow. So their main method of hunting was really sneaking up on their prey and then very quickly, swiftly attacking it. So bottom line is of this long intro is that every Aborigine group belonged to the land that was their land. They have always belonged to this land. They believe themselves to always in the future belong to this land. Each male group had a sacred place upon this land where the males had to go to conduct certain very central rituals to their identity. And when the Europeans came and started driving the Aborigines from their familiar lands, this was an absolute tragedy, because you could not relocate. As an Aboriginal person, you could not go and live with the tribe next door. The tribe next door had their own land plot, and these land plots have existed for eternity. But it was not a question of owning the land. The tribe didn't own the land. The land owned the tribe, or rather the family group. You see, I'm already slipping up because it's so easy to do. but Aboriginal people never really self-identified as us versus them. They identified as I'm the cousin of Joe and thrice removed sister of Jimmy, and my great grandmother was the aunt of the father of the uncle, and so on and so forth. That was how they saw themselves. That was what was important to them. Europeans did not understand the system. Europeans did not care to understand the system. They saw the fact that the Aboriginal society, which was actually extremely complex, their family relationships are the most complex family relationships of any group in the world. And their language is actually very reflective of family relationships, which is fairly, more so, in traditional societies, that is often the case, but more so than anywhere else in the world. Their language is also, it's interesting with Aboriginal languages, as there are some languages that are so tied to location that they don't have such thing as left, right, north, south. You don't talk about, they literally oriented themselves by various markers upon their land. So you didn't say my left or right foot. You said my foot that's closer to the Poky Mountain, or my foot that's further from the Poky Mountain. And so their entire set of spatial coordinates was completely tied to the land that they happened to live on. So yeah, these people looked very different. They behaved very different, and Europeans immediately categorized them as more subhuman than they did any other race that Europeans have ever dominated and sometimes exterminated, more so than the Africans, more so than the Native Americans, South or North America, more so than anyone else. They believe these people to be non-human, really. And so that opened up a very heated scientific debate as soon as there was science. Now, in the 18th century, when we still had plenty of Aboriginal people to study, nobody really cared to study them. By the time people started coming around and wanting to study them, we had very few Aboriginal peoples left. A lot of languages disappeared. Culture has been completely overturned and destroyed, and a lot of the Aboriginal peoples just have been mixed in with the European population. In one of the most recent genetic studies, the scientists complained that out of all the samples they took from modern Aboriginal peoples, over 80% of the samples from people who claimed and believed themselves to be pure Aboriginals actually had heavy admixture of European descent or other peoples, whether from Asia or somewhere else, and those samples wound up being unusable for the genetic study purposes. So let me go ahead and pull up. I'm going to stop and let you guys jump in if somebody has something to say while I'm pulling up a map.
What's also very unique about the Aboriginal people is that they still maintain an oral history.
Right. Yeah. As much as they can with that much of the loss of population, frankly.
Yeah. There's within their family groups, there's literally no written history. It's verbal. But they do also at the same time maintain an artistic history.
Basically, it's almost a visual illustrative history. So you guys can see my screen, right? And what we're looking at is what those parts of the world used to look like once upon a time. There used to be Southeastern Asia that was pretty much back in those days when there was the heights of the Ice Age and the oceans kind of receded, was the continent of Sundra. And then there was the continent that's known as Sahul, that included in it modern day Australia, New Guinea, Tasmanian, and other locations. And there's a lot of questions about how is it that people got from Africa, because we know that all humans originated in Africa. How is it that human beings got from Africa to Australia before they got anywhere else, even Europe? Some of the oldest remains of human beings, some of the oldest dating of various tools comes from Australia. The modern science debates the dates that they're talking about is somewhere at the oldest being 65,000 years ago, at the newest being around 40-something thousand years ago, that 50,000 years ago, that Australia was populated by modern human beings. So the question is, how did they get there? And the suggestion is that they traveled through Asia, they traveled through southern China, they traveled through Southeastern Asia, and they crossed from Sundra at the time when the oceans were really low. And so those continents that we no longer have were still above the waves. They were able to make quick crossings. Now, how quick is a big question. It is obvious that these people would have had to have some sort of floating devices. We have no idea what those were. I mean, it could have been anything at all. But it is clearly evidence for people being able to mitigate oceanic waters that early on. So again, I'm pulling up some of the other maps. This is what's called the Wallace's line, the blue line right here. And that's a very famous line. When biologists were first studying those regions, they noticed an interesting thing. They noticed that when you headed towards Asia from this line, Wallace's line, when you looked at your mammals, now this does not apply to birds and insects, it applies only to mammals, that placental mammals, our familiar mammals, did not really cross this line, and the marsupials seem to not have crossed the line the other way. Bottom line is a species unique to this region stayed in this region until humans introduced various new species, and the species that were unique of mammals stayed in this region. This is a reconstruction of Sahul as it may have been when the sea level was at negative 120 meters, which is when the earliest occupation would have likely taken place. And so the climate back then was slightly different than the climate today, not terribly different, just slightly different. It was a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter in certain parts. And so the central part of Australia that nowadays is a complete desert was a little bit more savanna-like. And then the climate in the north part of Australia was a little bit more similar to the northern climate in Europe, though of course the animals we had in Australia were very, very different than the ones in Europe. Anyway, so people started migrating out of Africa, again, according to different estimates, and some say it's far back as 74,000 years ago, some say, 55,000 years ago. Bottom line is people left Africa and it took them time to get across all this territory and actually make it to Australia and to those regions. Some theories suggest that the eruption of the volcano Toba, which is marked right here by a red dot, slowed down that progress. We see right here that red line is an estimate of where the ash cloud likely settled and killed everything. So that probably slowed people down for quite a while. Yeah, this is the death zone right here. The blue dots is where people, where scientists have been able to locate ash from the Toba explosion. This right here is a map of the sea levels, and also some of the suggested ways of how people may have gotten from Southeast Asia, back then the continent of Sandra, to modern day New Guinea, Tasmania, and Australia, which is the continent of Sahul back then. There are two competing theories. One theory suggests that they went over here, that's the southern route, through the island of Flores, hopped to the island of Timor. Most scientists seem to be more inclined to follow to go with the northern route, which is, and the reason being is because over here you have very long crossings where you cannot even see the land on the horizon. So scientists seem to be doubtful about whether or not people that early on would be willing to sail out because the original group that populated Australia would have had to been significant enough to create the biodiversity of peoples that we had there before Europeans came and happily destroyed them all. But just basically the island hopping over here, and the water barriers were a lot shorter on the northern route, and that's another route that's suggested. But and again, this is just the Wallace line, just a quick image and kind of how the modern day geography falls into the, the ancient geography, to where this would be your Southeast Sumatra, Borneo, Java Islands. Back then it was one big peninsula, and Sahul joined all these areas right here, and all the little islands in between were really tips of mountains now, if they exist at all. So chances are majority of our archaeological finds from that time period are under the waves, and we will never see them. What did the peoples meet when they came to Australia? Well, they met my favorite kind of animals. I'm a big fan of the marsupial megafauna. Australia was populated by something that humans as such have never, ever encountered before. Australia had a very large Komodo dragon type lizard that was one of the biggest ones in its history. Some estimated being as long as 7 feet tall, most likely not quite that big, but it was a definitely gigantic apex predator. There were crocodiles there. There still are huge saltwater crocodiles that actually travel between Asia and Australia and Asia, because These are crocodiles that are large enough and formidable enough that humans are actually, to this day, are a serious part of its diet. So, but they are able to actually transfer salt water. So they go to Australia and then they're like, maybe we go eat more humans somewhere else. And they go to New Guinea or they go to one of the Asian islands and they eat humans there. And then they go back to Australia. Every year, several people in Australia, no matter how much precautions, how many warning signs that are posted there, get eaten by these reptiles. And this is something that people who first arrived there had to deal with. I mean, when humans first arrived to Australia, Australia had diverse and very unique megafauna. It had its own predators. It had its own saber-toothed tiger equivalent. Now, all these animals were marsupials, which means they were one way or another related to the kangaroos, or at least similar to. Diplodonts, these wombat-like creatures, but they were really big. I mean, there were several tons. We're talking about a bull size, if not a mammoth size animal. There was a super giant kangaroos back then. I mean, even today's red giant kangaroo does not compare in size. Let me see, I have some of the other ones of these creatures. These are some of the other creatures. I mean, they had tapir-like animals. The short-faced kangaroo was an enormous, enormous kangaroo. A lot of these animals, marsupials, with the exception of couple of clades, are very slow and don't have very large brains because they simply never had to have very large brains because the predators they mostly had to deal with were similar to themselves. They were also marsupial. So what predators did we have besides these, various reptiles and besides the one that I already mentioned, which is Thylacoleo, which was the saber-toothed lion of Australia, a marsupial creature. We also had the marsupial wolf. They're also known as Tasmanian tigers. They were not tigers, they were not wolves, but those animals managed to survive. And this is right here is the saber-toothed marsupial lion. These creatures look nothing like anything you can imagine. Now, majority of these very large, fairly slow and not very smart animals got eaten very quickly by humans. If you peoples and you arrived to this new continent and you need to eat and you have all these really poisonous little critters in the grass and you have all these really slow moving but extremely vicious reptiles around, what do? Well, you just set fire to everything around you. And the fire pretty much burns everything. And these slow moving creatures, they cannot get away. And then next thing you know, not only you have no predators or no poisonous critters underfoot, but you also have ready cooked dinner. Majority of the large creatures got hunted to extinction. The creatures that did not get hunted to extinction, the creatures that actually benefited from the appearance of humans. Well, first of all, some plants did. There are plants in Australia that have coexisted with humans and humans setting fire to everything for so long that they actually don't germinate unless they are subjected to high temperatures, like their seeds don't germinate. And also kangaroos. The quicker moving kangaroos, the grazing kangaroos, were very pleased with the humans for clearing all this territory for them. So now they have these beautiful grasslands where they can happily graze. There's a problem with kangaroos in Australia right now to where they actually give out licenses to hunt down kangaroos because there's more kangaroos living in Australia today than there are human beings. And that's a problem. Now, the large, slow-moving marsupial wombats got eaten. They were giant tortoises, they got eaten. A lot of the smaller marsupials survived, and actually the smaller of the three marsupial predators that populated that continent. So there were three, excuse me, there was the Thylacoleo, which is the marsupial lion, saber-toothed lion. There was the marsupial Tasmanian tiger or Tasmanian wolf or marsupial wolf, survived up until 19 something, that the last one was killed because they meaning Europeans, believed that these creatures ate their sheep, which they didn't, by the way, and hunted them down to absolute extinction. And right about when they went extinct, they suddenly realized, oops, we hunted them down to extinction. Maybe we need to not hunt them down to extinction. Too bad, too late. The last one died at a zoo. And these creatures bred very successfully in the zoo, at the zoos, and could have easily been saved. They were not. And that's one of my personal sore points. And then the Tasmanian devils survived, but they did not survive on the mainland continent. They survived only in Tasmania, which is why they're known as Tasmanian devils. So humans wiped out all the apex predators and became apex predators themselves for many, many thousands of years. I'm going to stop, see if anybody has anything to say.
With my own experience in Africa, the use of fire, the use of fire as a hunting tool is Not so much directly. You set fire and you create fires and you trap animals and you essentially cook them. It's actually at certain times of the year, you set fire to a certain small areas, one area at a time. And because the landscape has become over generations, millenniums of years, has become used to fire as a natural condition, especially in particular in the dry season. The use of fire creates small patches of sweet green grass that immediately bloom up in its wake, which attracts all kinds of animals. And it makes them very, very susceptible and very vulnerable to hunting in these tiny little places. And so essentially, it's the sweet grass that's created in the wake of the fire that creates the trap within which you hunt the animal. Very effective.
Extremely. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because the Tasmanian Aborigines, for example, that was the only form of, I guess, sort of kind of not agriculture, of course, and not animal husbandry, but they did do control burns in certain areas for that very purpose to attract animals there. So they could create habitats for the animals that they hunted, kangaroos in particular.
Yeah, and the corollary would be, so here in North America, the corollary would be a buffalo run, a bison drop,
Right.
and that would be the corollary. Incredibly effective.
So humans hunted all this lovely megafauna to extinction, and now they only had kangaroos to hunt, and various sea creatures. I mean, sea cucumbers, for example, is very favorite food, and wallabies, which is a smaller version of kangaroo, of course, various birds, and so on and so forth. So at this point in time, humans were the apex predator on the land, and they remained that apex predator for a long time until about 4,000 years ago, 46,000 years after first humans made it to Australia. A new migration wave approximately 4,000 years ago introduced the dingo, which is believed to be related to the Indian dog, and most likely came with the new influx of people migrating from India. Now, there's a lot of interesting questions about who the first Australians really were, because Australian people to Europeans look so archaic because of their physical appearance. The Australians, it is believed that they practiced the deformation of the skull. And it's something that, the Scythians did, that heck, Europeans did up until 19th century. People in the South Americas did this, to where they, by various means, would tie a child's head when it was still a baby and the skull was still soft and kind of malleable, sometimes to playing from the front or from the back to achieve a special shape that they believed to be attractive. Well, the way the Aborigines, it seems, have done it, they didn't actually even tie the skulls to anything. The mother would just kind of, shape the child's skull while the child was still young. And so that's how we get these elongated skull shapes that some early scientists interpreted as them belonging to some other species, or having been intermixed with some other species. Aborigines have not been, are no different than any other humans on this planet. I mean, they do have some Denisovian admixture, but so does a lot of the Asian population and a lot of other peoples. They have some Neanderthal admixture, but so do all the modern Europeans and non-African populations. So in that sense, here are some images of the Australian Aboriginal people. They did not wear clothing regularly, and honestly, even to this day, Aboriginal people oftentimes appear like they just don't see a point in wearing it. It's not something that they require, and they mostly do it to humor the Europeans who demand it from them. They are people who are what's considered to be if you look at the typology, they're considered to be the equatorial type, and all that means that you're a person who lives around the equator, and so you have darker skin to better interact with the sunlight, to not get as much cancer. You have a wider nose because it's a hotter climate, and you need to be able to breathe better. But it's dark skin, for example, it's not even known whether or not the dark skin in the Australian populations came from the original settlers, or whether it was a secondary adaptation. There's some populations like the Tibetans, for example, who acquired secondary darker coloring from living up towards the mountaintops or living in the equatorial regions. There was obviously some admixtures from people coming from anywhere nearby, from Melanesia, from New Guinea. There were people traveling there. There was some, mostly people from India came about 4,000 years ago. So there were constant small influxes into the population, but it did not seem to terribly affect the overall population as such. Interesting question. Let me stop sharing and open up the linguistic map. An interesting thing happened as far as the languages go. Now, Australia, when Europeans first came to it, had about 200 some odd languages on the Australian continent. Very unique languages that have, a lot of them have disappeared since. An interesting thing happened about 6,000 years ago with Australian populations and their languages. Okay, what I'm going to pull up here is the linguistic map. You will see that in yellow, this is, let me see which one. This is the English version of the linguistic distribution of the Aboriginal languages in Australia. Here's the Russian School of Linguistics, but regardless of which map you look at, you see that both maps have this chunk of really large territory that's covered with this particular one language group. And actually, it's mostly one language. And that is the dominant language, the largest language on the territory of Australia right now. And that is the Pama-Nyungan language group. And it seems that this language group is something that spread out throughout Australia about 6,000 years ago, almost like a storm by itself, but without the, geneticists have not been able to see any significant genetic influx or change in the population. All they see is that suddenly this linguistic family just exploded and took over everywhere. And the only guess that anybody has been able to make, and as far as why this happened, is most likely a few individuals traveling throughout the country spread out possibly their worldview, their religion, their outlook on the world. Because, Aborigine cultures are surprisingly similar in the way that they perceive, now I went too far again, I'm going to stop sharing. The way they perceive reality. We will talk a lot more about mythology. We'll talk a lot more about culture next time. Like I said, this is mostly about evolution and, peopling and the evolution of people. So the traits that first European scientists that started describing Aborigines thought to be archaic traits in the Aborigine population turned out to be a modern adaptation. The heavy brow ridges, the the sloped shape of the skull of the Aborigine people. Aborigine people today are pretty gracile. That means they're not very large peoples, but they have very heavy, kind of noticeable heads. And of course, Europeans immediately started comparing them to various extinct hominids. That's had nothing to do with it. Because originally the population in the first peoples who arrived to Australia, the very first, the oldest dated findings, archaeological findings, were actually fairly gracile people with very delicate gracile again, meaning thin, eloquent, not very pronounced skull shape and no eyebrow ridges. And then the next population that was found after that, actually several thousand years ago, turned out to be a lot more heavyset. And there's a couple very key finds actually in Australia that the rest of the archaeological finds in Australia they illustrate that point. But very, very important finds. First of all, the Lake Mungo find, where they found about 40-something peoples. No, sorry, that's not the population I'm thinking about. They found peoples from about 47,000 years ago. And Lake Mungo used to be a lake. Nowadays, it's a dried lake bed. And it dried about 18,000 years ago. So they found some people buried there in various poses. All the burials are done in different poses. Some are done sitting, some are done lying down. There's one woman who has been cremated. It's the oldest known cremation at the time when material that I was looking at was written down, was known around the world, but her skeleton is very, very gracile, very delicate, not very large. And some of those finds are dated to at least 47,000 years ago. Another very, very famous and very controversial find was the find of the Cow Swamp people. Cow Swamp is another location in Australia, and that particular location, they found a lot of individuals. Those remains have been reburied since they were found. They were studied and then reburied in 1985 as a part of respect for the Aboriginal peoples. But they found quite a few individual burials, individual remains of peoples. And these people were a little bit heavier. That's in Northern Victoria, by the way, region. They were excavated between 68 and 72, but they found a lot of people. And these people were also dated about 95 to 14 years, 14,000 years before our time. And they've looked completely different from the modern Aboriginal peoples. So there is actually and they found 40 individuals, women, children, men at that location. And then another find, Kubul Creek find, 126 individuals were found in a sandy ridge. Those were dated from between 9,000 and 13,000 years ago. And these people were extremely heavy set comparing to the other finds as far as their bones go. There is just such a morphological difference between different finds. And what's interesting, it seems like the people who originally arrived to Australia were fairly gracile, and then the evolution went towards heavier, more pronounced brow ridges and so on and so forth, and then again went to lighter, stature, and then again to have more heavy skull, thicker skull bones. So what Europeans early on assumed to be primitive traits turned out to be actually just evolutionary, not even adaptations, more like population drift, when the females, for whatever reason, just happened to like men with bigger eyebrow ridges, and suddenly your whole population gains big eyebrow ridges. And then women decide they want men with beards, and all the men with beards become very popular, and so on and so forth. So actually, you will oftentimes hear that the Aboriginal people are they've been preserved in the Stone Age, that they have, they're the last living culture of ancient prehistoric peoples. That's not true. They haven't set in place. They have evolved throughout time. But this kind of variation in the population morphology throughout time caused some scientists to believe that they were possibly admixed with some very ancient hominids, even Homo erectus, for example, which turned out not to be true. There's also an interesting question. Is it okay if we go over a little bit, guys? Are you okay with that? There's also the interesting question about, I'm going to, warning, not politically correct information to follow. In the Western world today, this theory is considered to be debunked and thrown away. In the Eastern world, this theory, and this is objective, is considered to not have been debunked nor proven, but simply dismissed. And therefore, it is the most best documented theory to this date, because the people who came up with this theory actually are the only people in history of Australian anthropology who put in the legwork. They literally traveled to every part of the Australian continent, and they physically measured people's skulls, physically measured people, living Aborigines at the time. This was between 1930s, 1960s. They took hundreds and hundreds of individual measurements from different populations, and they had anthropological data to prove it. They did it before some of the Aboriginal communities disappeared altogether or got mixed amongst themselves by being placed in something similar like to reservations. Before they got just as heavily admixed with the encroaching Europeans and Asians and so forth. And this is the politically incorrect, utterly debunked and thrown away, considered to be inappropriate, the tri-hybrid theory. Australian citizens would probably be very offended at me for saying this, both Aborigine and non-Aborigine, because this theory is, it's been used by the far-right advocates against the Aboriginal rights to prove that the Australian Aborigines were not the first people in Australia. And what does this theory suggest? Well, the study that these two individuals, and I'll pull up the names of the explorers, but the two explorers came up with a theory that there were three waves of settling of the Australian continent. Because the first populations, excavated populations that are found, like I said, are fairly gracile, fairly kind of delicate skeletal remains, and also very thin skulls. The next population, thousands of years later, suddenly shows very robust, very thick skull and body structure, much larger individuals. much. Some argue that there are much more primitive tools associated with those peoples, and then there's a third population, which, according to official Australian anthropological science, simply doesn't exist or did exist, and that's the peoples I'm going to show you right now. How many of you have heard of Australian pygmies? And yet there was, and as recently as 1960s, there were such people as Australian pygmies, and I'm going to show you some images. There's some nudity. If you're offended by nudity, I'm sorry, but these are original anthropological photographs. So when these scientists were researching all the available data on Australian Aborigines, they came across this photo that was taken in 1930s. Now, this is a tribe of people who live in the Cairn region of Australia, in the rainforest regions of Australia. And if you notice what we have in the background of banana leaves, now banana leaves in Australia, we know how tall those are, right? Which would mean that these people, which a lot of them are some adult males, as you can see, are fairly short, but adult females. Here's a photo of one of those Aborigine peoples with an average European, and this is a grown adult male of 24 years old. So the question, and since then, since 1960s, up until 1960s, these people were very well known. They were hunter-gathering tribes that sometimes would come out to the missions to get some food. And go back into the rainforest. Then they were settled into these kind of designated living facilities with other Aboriginal tribes. Bottom line is, today, the names of the tribes exist. The people of that stature no longer exist. There are some estimations that they most likely have been just intermixed with other Aboriginal groups and lost their uniqueness. These people, now, one of the things that makes Aboriginal people stand out is that a lot of the people from the equator, they have very curly, whatever you want to say it, hair. Aborigines, and as well as a lot of the Aborigines, not all of them, as well as people in Papua New Guinea, not only do they have wavy hair oftentimes, but they also have, oftentimes they have children that are born almost blonde, or at least very light-haired for their particular coloration, and their hair gets darker as they get older. Papua New Guinea, this happens. We don't know about the Tasmanians because Tasmanians been wiped out, but in certain groups of Australian Aborigines, that is a known fact. These peoples that were known as pygmies had very curly hair. They had some other traits that the original proponents of this theory, of the trihybrid theory, they suggested that maybe those were the remnants of the original wave of the migration into the region, which would have been the same migration of the people who populated India, the Negrito people of the Philippines, and very early migrations of the early humans out of Africa. And that the subsequent two waves of migrations, first of the more gracile modern, I mean, they're all modern humans, but then there were the more gracile kind of our heights of humans, and then came the more robust migration later. That those subsequent waves of migration basically wiped out the original pygmy population. And the reason why this theory is considered to be so politically incorrect and so inappropriate is because it suggests that the Aboriginal people were not the first people to settle the Australian continent. And it gives the far right the chance to start stomping their feet and screaming, well, we didn't genocide anyone, because guess what? You genocided the pygmies. So if you talk to any Australian academician today, they're going to shake their head and they're going to walk away and say that this theory has been debunked. Well, that's all good and nice. Here's the thing. That was the only time in history of study of Australia when any scientist put in as much legwork and studied as much, actually went out and studied everything that had to do with the Australian population, actually physically measured these people, looked at their morphology, and they have a clear data set, a large representative data set of how these people looked, what their actual measurements were, and everything else. And the names of these, by the way, the people who originally came up with the trihybrid theory were Tyndale and Birdsell. They were, when they came out with this theory, they were first questioned, and then some scientists started kind of maybe sort of leaning towards that, and that's when the Aboriginal rights, freedom, and pushback movement started gaining traction. In 1974, and around that time, the Aborigines put up forth a cry, and rightfully so, that we all, original Australians, and we all, regardless of who we are, need to see ourselves as one single population and support each other. And they rejected the idea that they were different waves of migration, they said that this was just a variation that happened within a population, that there was a single major, primary migration wave of peoples coming into Australia, and that from that migration wave, all these different variations happened. Which one of these theories you believe, again, is entirely up to you. Like I said, modern day science considers the tri-hybrid theory to be completely debunked. I suspect mostly for political reasons. And if it had not been taken up as a flag by the far right, it may have been looked at more closely, because it is obvious that there were more than one wave of migrations into any continent, let alone Australia. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say.
Well, just multiple migrations seems likely to me because, like you said, other continents, we know that happened also. And it happened a long time ago, most likely. So it's not out of the question.
There almost certainly were multiple waves, I would think, just because look at North and South America. There were multiple waves that came there. I mean, you're dealing with pretty small sample sizes, but I think there's human evolution's more like a bush than a tree.
Right.
And you've got lots of little interminglings and interbreedings, and I think to me it seems very likely that there would have been multiple waves, and it may have been more than 3.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing. I mean, some of the things that would speak somewhere towards the ideas that Birdsall predicted in his last book, in his last publication, that if mitochondrial lineages were compared between New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, and also, this is not something he predicted, but in the Philippines, that they would find some certain differences and some similarities. If the descendants of the Cairns rainforest peoples of the Pygmies and the Tasmanians were included in that study, that they would come off as being similar, because part of the tri-hybrid theory was that the Tasmanian population, which was very morphologically different from the rest of the ancient Australians, that they were also representative of that original wave of migration. Papua New Guinea and Australia definitely have a relation, were populated by the same population, I guess, for lack of a better term. And but another recent very recent news that came out in the study of genetics is that we know that Denisovians have contributed to a large portion of non-African population of the world, particularly in Asia. Now, the largest percentages of, up until recently, the largest percentage of Denisovian DNA was found actually in people living in Australia, out of the people who have been researched. But the most recent news is that the Negrita population, which was the Aboriginal population of the Philippines, very small tribe, who look very similar to what the Tasmanians are described to look like. I mean, and this is just outward looks, that they don't mean anything. That they have even higher level of Denisovian DNA. I mean, I don't know. There seem to be some correlations. And maybe we will just never know. But I do think that if you step away from the politics, the idea that there were multiple waves of people populating those regions, I think that makes a lot of sense. Especially considering that we know, I mean, there are burials of people from Melanesia, and from New Guinea, like literally people floated there, like fishermen or sea cucumbers gatherers who died there or lived there for a while and left their remains and buried their friends, whatever people that they came with. So we know that there were other peoples making it there. We know that people from the Indian continent came there with their dingo about 4,000 years ago. So I don't see why there could have not been multiple migration waves. And the last thing I really want to talk about in this episode is the people of Tasmania, which are being very decisively and intentionally wiped out from memory by today's peoples. And that is probably the most atrocious. I mean, I'm not big on focusing on atrocities committed by this group, but with that group, we recently have dealt with the advent of the BLM movement. Well, the Tasmanian population is somebody who is never going to have their version of BLM movement because there are no Tasmanians left. I'm going to pull up a couple of pictures of the Tasmanian peoples and tell you what happened there. Now, Tasmania originally was populated by not very many people. Tasmania is a rainforest, heavy rainforested area. It's basically it's an island. The people got isolated there when the sea levels rose. They got isolated there, but they stayed isolated from any other population, even from the Australians, mainland peoples. So they kind of had their own individual evolution. And these people evolved. You can see that they look kind of different from the Australians. They don't have the same tendency for the heavy eyebrow ridges. They lost a lot of their tools, because when you get isolated with a small population on a small island, every time somebody dies, that's a chunk of knowledge that falls out of your population. So the smaller is the population, the less likely it is to accumulate as much knowledge altogether as a larger group may have, because each individual that you lose to some predator who falls off a mountain cliff basically is a whole library of knowledge that's gone forever. But there was about 8 to 10 groups living on the island of Tasmania. There's considered to be two kind of a language, not so much families as language subgroups. The population of the total population of that island is estimated to be between 5,000 and 6,000 people to begin with, before the Europeans came. And then the Europeans came, and they wanted to farm. And so at first, the Tasmanians were very friendly and very welcoming towards the Europeans. And then the Europeans decided that the Tasmanians were not happy with them taking over their land and clearing it for agriculture. And so they started doing things like issuing laws against Tasmanian people's living. For example, they couldn't go to the side of the island where the Europeans have settled. If they crossed that invisible line, they would be shot on sight. European gentlemen with their friends and wives and servants, would go on safaris. Their horrific accounts, I'm not going to quote them, of people who would chase a whole tribe of 30-something people into space between two rocks and open fire, kill all the men, and then start yanking women and children out of their hiding spots and stomping them with their horses. People bragged about it. People competed how many women they could kill in a day. It was considered to be a good day if you could kill a couple women. I mean, whole tribes were chased. I mean, these people were armed with spears. Their level of, they were a small population. Their wars and their conflicts probably didn't even know what warfare was. These people were chased down and chased down and chased down until there were 300 of them left. And 300 of those people were relocated to nearby, more or less desolate island, where they rapidly died thereafter. Europeans, between 1830 and 1860, within 30 years, the Tasmanian population ceased existing completely. This is the last living family known. You can see now that they're in European clothes. And this is the last known Tasmanian woman. And that's that. I mean, her name was, I'm sharing, right? Her name was,
that was me screwing up.
Her name was Truganini, and I would not want to be in the shoes of this woman, because she has seen everything and everyone she has ever loved murdered before her eyes. And she had to live among the murderers of her peoples, all her peoples, not just her personal tribe, not just her children and grandchildren, not just her husband, not just her habitat, her way of life. She had to wear their clothing and live among them and die among them as the last survivor of her entire people. And that's something that I want us all to just think about for a minute, that a whole peoples was destroyed because they got underfoot. And nobody is going to ever write for them, and nobody is ever going to shout for them. And every place that they have lived has been renamed. And every time their remains are dug up, they kind of dug back in. I mean, there's not a lot of archaeological finds, except for 1 or 2 sites from Tasmania. It's a dirty little secret. What was done to the Aboriginal people was horrendous. A lot of similar things happened to Aboriginal people of Australia. Native Americans have faced some horrible treatment by the colonizing peoples. African populations, especially the slavery trade in but at least they have descendants. You know, there are people today who claim to be the Tasmanian descendants, but they are so deluded. And honestly, there's not even a DNA study possibility. There are people who do have some Tasmanian blood left in them from the women who were probably taken in and raped. But yeah, that's a nation, a tribe, a world, a culture, a reality, a whole race that's been wiped out completely. So that's pretty much a non-happy note I kind of finish this on.
It sounds very much like some of the smaller tribes in California
Right.
were decimated that kind of way during the gold rush.
So yeah, that's pretty much, that's some other images. Those were some paintings that were taken of these peoples, some photographs that were taken of these peoples. This right here, just really quickly, some of the stone tools from Australia. They haven't evolved very much. Some people say that they're fairly primitive, but then again, a lot of their tools in Australia were made out of wood. Wood, as we know, does not survive. Wood is easy to work with. Hopefully in the next episode, we will talk a lot more about mentality, culture, worldview, and the way of life of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. But I just want us all to be aware of what happened to the Tasmanian population. That's pretty much everything I've really wanted to talk about today.
One thing to think about as we move forward in these discussions is no one really wants to leave their home. And it takes great, it takes great circumstance for people to need or to leave their home. And that is as true as that is today. It is as true as it was 50,000 years ago. So why, I mean, and it's very difficult for us to put our, minds, 50,000 years ago. Why do people need to migrate? Why do they need to move? Why do they need to find a new home, leave their home for a new one?
My answer is the same as my answer to any questions people ask about any today's social phenomenon: overpopulation. Same reason why Vikings, kind of moved forward from their regions. Same reason why, Greeks colonized: overpopulation, overexploitation,
Or climate change.
or climate change. Right. All right, guys. Well, I think that's everything for today, and we're way ran over time. Does anybody else have anything else you guys want to say? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It was awesome as always. All right, everybody. Well, we'll see you, everyone, 2 weeks from now. Thanks for joining. Thank you.
Yeah, everybody be well. Thanks.
Bye.
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 Glow of a campfire, daylight, laughter, electrical glow. Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.